Welcome to the Long Free Ride.
Welcome back to the Long Free Ride. In this episode you see us exploring Bergen, and for those of you that may not be sure where Bergen is, it's 100 or so miles up the western coast of Norway, and it's their second largest city. If we zoom in, you can see that we were actually staying out near the airport. This means that we needed to catch the light rail into the town each day. On the first day in Bergen, we spent a lot of our time in the sort of port area, and on the second day we took a look at some of the parks, museums, theatres, before heading back to the port area and going to the Bryggen Museum.
Our day started by getting yet another app on our phone and downloading something called a Bergen Card. We'll explain more later, but basically it is a discount travel card. It's about 30 minutes on the train, but we were well entertained by a group of school children who wanted to practice their English on us. They were 8 years old and off on a day trip into the centre of Bergen. They were a lot of fun and so brave to speak in a foreign language to complete strangers. When we arrived, we weren't actually expecting quite such a long walk to get into town, but they were renovating the rail track, so we got a little bit diverted. But all's good, and it was quite a nice day for a walk, really. One of the top tourist attractions in Bergen is to go up the Funicular. And this is the Floyen mountain. Bergen's actually surrounded by 7 mountains, but the Funicular takes you up this one. It's only 6 minutes each way, and it's been running for over 100 years. I was still a little bit wobbly knees, let's say, on going, but I did feel better because we got a discount on the fare by using our Bergen card, so it was well worth the effort of getting the app on the phone. Not only is there a stunning view at the top, as long as the weather's good enough for you to see it, they were doing lots of really interesting things around their sustainability programs. So the funicular is fully electric. They have cashmere goats up there that sort of keep the grass in check. The cafe grows some of its own produce on what they call a mat tack, which translates basically into a food roof. So they use the roofs of buildings to actually grow a lot of the produce. And then we saw a forest school on a day trip to this visitor centre as well. So they were teaching the next generation about nature, horticulture, sustainability. But mainly, we were there for the great view across Bergen.
Having finished grabbing some footage at the top of the funicular, we had a coffee, admired the view one last time, and then headed back down into town. I was impressed to see how many of the older buildings had been sympathetically restored, or just how well they were kept in general. It helped keep that real Nordic feel to what was a large city with, in some areas, very modern buildings. We walked down towards the waterside, primarily because that's where the visitor centre was, and Michelle wanted to see if we could get a booking for a restaurant. But also there was a fish market there and a number of open-air dockside restaurants where you could eat the fresh fish. So it seemed a bit rude not to. They even had a special beer to go with fish. Who knew? After lunch we went to explore an area called Bryggen, which translates as dock. But centuries ago it would have been called the German dock, because this plot of land was owned by a German trading organisation called the Hanseatic League, who dominated trade in northern Europe from the 13th to late 15th centuries. These German merchants lived in many cities and towns across northern Europe. They kept themselves to themselves and dealt in many of the commodities needed for everyday life. As you can see from this map, some of the towns and cities we have visited on our tour were once Hanseatic centres. Indeed, London had its own Hanseatic dock, known as the Steel Yard, that has nothing to do with the metal we know today. It doesn't exist anymore and it's under the site of the Cannon Street railway station. England would have exported wool via this trade, but to come back to Bergen, their trade was then our old friend, the stockfish. If you haven't seen our episode on the Lofoten Islands, then this will tell you more about the stockfish. Link is in the description below. This model shows how tightly packed the wooden buildings were, making fire an ever-present threat. Each building would have had a number of merchants, all men, with apprentices joining around 14 and potentially staying till their 30s, when they would return to Germany as wealthy merchants and start a family. The only stone areas in each building were the kitchens, where each group sharing the building would cook before eating and socialising in a common room next door. Fires were banned in all areas other than the kitchens, so a closed fireplace had to have coals shoveled into them from the kitchens to provide warmth. Even so, there were still many catastrophic fires down through the centuries. Today, Bryggen is both a UNESCO heritage site as well as a thriving shopping and entertainment area with bars, hotels and restaurants. It still has the many cramped walkways and historic buildings, letting you feel like you've stepped back into a time gone by, except with 5G so you can update your Insta. We really enjoyed learning about the Hanseatic League and touring some of their original and reconstructed buildings. We'd thoroughly recommend that if you go to Bergen, you take this tour. After our both cultural and educational afternoon, we headed into a bar to get a drink. Then we wandered down some of Bergen's pretty roads and looked at some of the street art on the buildings before catching a train back to the hotel for the night.
The next day, after another free ride on their light railway, we walked down towards the art museum and looked around the public gardens and some of the sculptures.
During our tour, we had visited a number of cities where you could hire an electric scooter. I thought this might be fun and might move us around Bergen more quickly. But I think Michelle spent her childhood with her nose in a book, not like me, falling out of trees, crashing vehicles and setting things on fire. So after 30 minutes of going round and round in circles, practicing, I decided it was too risky to let Michelle mix with the traffic. So we caught a small electric ferry instead to the other side of the harbour. We were on our way to the Bryggen Museum to learn about Bergen in Viking times, but first we grabbed a sandwich for lunch.
I'm not sure if John didn't like the sandwich that we had for lunch, but he ended up feeding some of it to the local birds. This took a surprisingly long time, and he sat still for ages, made me move away because apparently I was making too much noise, and he was so pleased with himself when both the pigeon and the little starling hopped onto his hand to feed. I couldn't resist the look on John's face when he'd achieved this. Naturally, I insisted on lots of hand sanitizer immediately after this experience, to a point when John asked me to stop nagging. We went from our picnic benches to the Bryggen Museum. Now, sadly, they wouldn't allow filming inside, but it was a great tour back to the Middle Ages, and they've actually found building remains and artefacts proving that there was international trade from Bergen. Their depiction of all the city fires through the history of Bergen really struck a chord with me and reinforced what we'd learnt from the Hanseatic houses earlier that day about only having fires in one area and making sure it was a stone room to try and improve their safety and security. Whilst we wait for the ferry to go and get dinner, I'll fill you in on the Bergen Card. So this is basically a discount card. You can order it online from the Visit Bergen website. You can get a physical one if you want that from hotel lobbies or the tourist office. But literally it gave us free transport from our out of town accommodation, both into and around town. We also got discounts on things like the Funicular. We could have also gone to the cable car. It also gives you free admission or discounted admission to museums, sightseeing tours, restaurants, parking, and some of the small ferry trips. The pass comes with a number of options, so sort of 24-hour, 48-hour, and the 48-hour one in the peak of summer cost us £34.50 each. We believe it was well worth this discount given the amount of transport we used and just the few museums that we got to go into. Now the bit I'd really been waiting for, dinner at Cornelius. John's Norwegian friends had told us this was the best seafood restaurant and that there was no way we'd be able to get in there because we hadn't booked months and months in advance. We got lucky. I accept it might have taken 3 phone calls, a couple of emails and a reservation online. However, we did get lucky. Somebody pulled out and we were able to fill their space. The restaurant Cornelius isn't actually Michelin stars yet. I would say personally, I think they're well on their way. The style of the food, very fresh, local, seasonal. It was presented immaculately. It was a very clean sort of plating style. It wasn't confused with 100 different things. The service was attentive but not intrusive. Very clever serving staff, speaking multiple languages. It really was a mixture of the guests that were there. The menu we chose was a set 5-course featuring local produce, and it's called their meteorological menu. So we started with reindeer. It had been locally sourced, it was beautifully tender and sliced very thinly. Next up was a crab croquette. This was John's favourite course. Next was a beautiful piece of cod with lentils. Now I'm not a big lentil fan, but I would definitely have this dish again. Next up was another white fish. It was locally sourced, but I cannot remember the name of it, but it came with a cauliflower puree and chunks of cauliflower too. Dessert was a rhubarb with a custard ice cream, some nuts and cream on the side as well. I finished the meal with a sea breeze cocktail. What else, of course? So that's a mixture of vodka, cranberry and grapefruit juice. And we were able to sit there and wait for the ferry to go back to the mainland. It was a really lovely evening in a great setting with good service, even better food, and I would highly recommend it to anybody going to Bergen. Book in advance, go to Cornelius. It's well worth it just for the experience.
The next morning we boarded a ferry which would take us to the very top of Denmark. Our original plan had been to drive to Oslo and then cross back to Denmark via the long bridge we used on the way up. But this would involve a couple of very long days behind the wheel, and an overnight ferry with a cabin, whilst an extra expense, seemed the best way of keeping the trip fun and us refreshed. I was sad to see Bergen slowly disappear in the ship's wake. Norway had shown us so many fantastic sights, and it seemed that we were leaving too soon. But with only 4 days of our tour to go, there was no way we could stay any longer. Perhaps we will be back one day, but for now our future plans take us elsewhere. If you live in Norway, then thank you for your hospitality and speaking such perfect English, because we speak no Norwegian. Well, other than tack. Let us know in the comments below where we should visit if we come back again. There's no stats for this episode. The only driving we did was to get to the port, so we'll add those to the next episode. I know she's got a safety harness on and everything, but that girl, she's got balls of steel.